From 1995 to 2009, he was in fact a staff reporter for the New York Times, covering environmental matters, and he now writes the .earth blog for the op-ed side of the paper. And he's also, in addition to that, the Senior Fellow for Environmental Understanding at Pace University. As I think you all perhaps know even better than I do, he's covered such things as the changing conditions in the Amazon and the Arctic, the impact of rising population, the relationship of science and politics, which we just had a discussion of. He's written numerous books, including Puzzles and Perils at the Top of the World, which is actually a sort of an environmental book for the whole family, if you will. And The Burning Season, which became a well-regarded HBO film. He's won a slew of major journalistic awards, including the John Chancellor Award for Sustained Journalistic Excellence from Columbia University. And in addition to all of this, I gather that he is a performing songwriter in his spare time. So, Andrew Revkin of the New York Times.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I just got here in time, but it was a 2-hour drive from Mount Sinai Medical Center where I was speaking about the human microbiome, the environment that connects us all, that everyone who touched the doorknob here is connected to everyone else by the microbiome that we all share. And it's just an amazing new arena of science that's caught everybody by surprise. It's a non-genetic inheritance. It's got so many issues that are going to percolate and build just along with synthetic biology. And what I was basically talking to them about today was look at issues like global warming and fracking and GM foods and make sure you're thinking ahead as this new arena emerges about the issues and opportunities you're going to confront about how it's requiring a whole new way of thinking about biology. How do you teach biology in a world that's essentially upending a lot of the traditions? That's an amazing arena. But there is crossover because it's about this conversation we have about risk and risk and reward that come with different things. So it has some relationship to the conversation we've been having for a few decades now about global warming. And I wish I could have been here today for the science discussion because I'm always eager for updates on the arenas, because even with what we know, there's a ton that we still don't know. The durable uncertainty around basic questions like how fast is sea level going to rise on short timescales is the kind of reality that bogs down some of the policy discussions. And it's not manufactured uncertainty, it's real. So, and it's those kinds of issues that prompted in 2006 when the Supreme Court was confronting carbon dioxide, this kind of reaction, which I love this moment because you could interpret what Scalia said here as just, conservative justice recoiling from wanting to deal with a pollution question. But I think it goes much deeper than that. When he says, the way this played out, this was, the question of whether CO2 should be restricted under the Clean Air Act. And James Milkey, representing the state of Massachusetts, was explaining a fact of science. Actually, Your Honor, it's not the stratosphere, it's the troposphere we're talking about. And Justice Scalia says, troposphere, whatever. I told you before, I'm not a scientist. Laughter. Come on. And that's in the transcript. That's the official transcript. That's why I don't want to have to deal with global warming, to tell you the truth. So, and now when he said that, again, as I said, you could just interpret that as some conservative guy who doesn't want to deal with a new regulatory issue, or you could realize that deep down in virtually everybody who confronts this tough question, what do we do about global warming? How much is too much? What do you do about it? That there's layers of, oh my God, this is, as you'll see in a minute, some people call, there's a category problem that economists deal with called wicked problems, and this is a super wicked problem. So it's left a lot of us, like this photographer. I took this picture at the Copenhagen climate talks after 2 weeks of hermetically sealed discussions that went basically nowhere. There was this big expectation with Obama coming into office, finally, we're going to get it done, and Ban Ki-moon was saying, seal the deal, as if some deal was going to magically make this issue of decarbonizing a growing global energy menu go away. And anyone who was involved in tracking this for a long time knew that was always a fantasy. And as I said, this has led to serious scholarship on the reality that this is a super wicked problem, not just a wicked problem. The layers, and the deepest layer at the back end of everything is the layer that's in our heads. That's why I called this talk An Inconvenient Mind. This is, by the way, brand new. I haven't done this before. It's a new way of looking at things. So your crash test dummies, you're not dummies, but you're crash testing something that's new. This paper is well worth reading on several levels, but the level that I think is most relevant is that phrase, the second phrase in the paper. It's titled, Richard Lazarus at Harvard, Restraining the Present to Liberate the Future. Now just think about those words and realize how hard that is. Setting aside the complexities of the science and the complexities of the what do you do about it, just how many times have we been capable as a species of restraining the present to liberate the future? It's a hard problem, and that, I think, but Rob Sokolow here, there are many people here who have thought about this deeply, and but this literature, and this derived from a paper by Kelly Levin, who's now at World Resources Institute, both of which are really worth digging into. And so that little shortcut there goes to the Lazarus paper. I put that up. j.mp/superwicked. So now, there are other aspects. I'm going to start with the broadest scope of what we're looking at. And of course, the broadest scope is our historical moment is extraordinary. Our species has had many moments on this planet. When we left Africa, all kinds of things happened. But nothing quite compares to the last couple of centuries. And there's a website, populationaction.org, where you can plug in your birthday date and see where you are in the curve of us for the last 200 years. And that's me, 1956. Anyone else 1956? Hey, cool. So there were like 2.7 billion of us then, back in the, way back when. And I guarantee you, well, it's just interesting to kind of consider it that way. And it's not just, of course, as you know, this isn't a question of us vaulting up in numbers, but our appetites for resources have exploded at the same time. And it's all been kind of it has the feel of a binge. And that's why I've written about this before in two different ways. One is that we're going through puberty at the scale of a planet as a species. You just substitute fossil fuels for testosterone and you get the idea. And we've all, virtually everyone here has been through puberty, so you know what that's like. It's an ugly process, lots of turbulence and unpredictability and potentially really bad outcomes. And if you survive, you kind of are wiser and more durable. And some people don't survive. And I've seen in my own sons, some close calls, but so far they've scraped the guardrails. Literally, one of my sons 2 weeks ago, working an overnight job, he fell asleep at the wheel, and thank God he scraped the guardrail instead of going off the road. And now, as a species, we face that same question. Can we integrate the questions, the data that are coming from scientists, the findings, and be other than bacteria on agar? The other thing I point to quite often is so far there isn't a lot of evidence to differentiate us in terms of our growth rates and our resource appetites from bacteria growing on agar. Anyone done that experiment when you were a kid? It's like it grows until the resource runs out or the toxins from the waste products build up, and then you end up with some kind of weird steady state or something else happening. But we have this gift of foresight. I was at a meeting, I spoke yesterday at the Smithsonian, at a meeting on the Anthropocene, and the question of the moment was, which is something I wrote about 20 years ago in my first book on global warming, was we're in a race between potency and self-awareness. And can we, get the self-awareness into gear fast enough with then the response? Can we go from awareness to response? Can we do that fast enough to avoid hitting the edge of the petri dish consciously? Or are we just going to be doomed to constantly butt up against limits and have some hard times as a result? We could have done that in the old days and kind of said, okay, well, I kind of screwed up, that polluted that lake, let's go to the next lake. But now, we're at the planet scale. So with atmospheric gases and with this acidification of the ocean, these issues are getting different. The scope of the nature of the petri dish is different. And scientists for the last 50 years have basically been yelling, slowly, first they weren't yelling, they were kind of pointing and saying, there's an edge to the petri dish. And we as society were kind of going, okay. And then they were saying it a little louder and then a little louder, and lately there's been more of a sense of urgency. There really is an edge to the petri dish. We can see these planetary boundaries. You can name the different memes that have been tried. And here was Martin Parry in 2007 in Paris at the rollout of the IPCC report, literally with a laundry list of petri dish edges, water, atmosphere, species, et cetera. But there's something about what you see here that reminded me back in my adolescence to the chiding parent. There's this sense of, again, like the Scalia sense of reluctance to accept a tough message, and that we have to kind of learn that on our own. And it reminded me, I was sifting back through some films that I remembered of Rebel Without a Cause.
You know what kind of drunken brawls those kind of parties turn into? It's not a place for kids.
A minute ago, you said you didn't care if he drinks.
He said a little drink.
You're tearing me apart!
So society is kind of James Dean, and the IPCC or these surrogates are kind of Jim Backus. And that doesn't get very far at the level of an individual or the level of a species. And it's been a tough situation. And what I realized too in writing, I've been writing about climate change since the 80s. My first long article was on nuclear winter. Alan Robach who's in the room I think you're in my piece, along with others. And it was this issue of a human changed the atmosphere, in that case going in the other direction. And then in 1988, I wrote a 6,000 word or 7,000 word cover story for Science Digest on Discover magazine on global warming that had kind of all the same beats that have been in every one of the hundreds of stories I've written since. And you see the same thing in the IPCC reports. So it's sort of the same tune, a little bit different beat, a little more powerful notes, but a little more volume. But the fundamentals have not changed. And so I went through like 20 years of writing about this biogeophysical problem issue and writing increasingly about the policy questions related to it. And then I stumbled in the last 5-7 years into the social science research that was always so neglected within the IPCC process as well, which shows you that we're not going to get this. We're not going to get this right on many different levels, the level of the individual, level of the history of our diplomacy. You can see there's a body of research that kind of says this is really going to be hard, if possible at all. And so I started writing increasingly about, again, our inconvenient mind and how that relates to the bigger challenges that sort of frame this carbon question. And again, I wrote a piece in .Earth a couple of years ago saying climate is not the story of our time. This bigger issue is the story of our time. Going from a sense, can we apply the lessons of history and the insights of science looking forward in ways that can meaningfully reduce risks in a world where things are getting more consequential. And that's, whether it's biodiversity or climate, it's the same question, or disaster resilience. And I'll mention a few of those things going forward. So I did a piece on .Earth a couple of years ago to illustrate one of the realities that gets in the way, which is this body of work, largely out of Yale and some other institutions working on what they call cultural cognition. And I'm sure a bunch of you know this, and some of this derives from Kahneman's work right here. There's a primal nature to how people in this room react to information that almost guarantees that, well, maybe not this room, but you can get a subset of any population and find people who have different reactions to risk, and different reactions to risk messages, different reactions to the same body of science. And at the culturalcognition.net website, you can see empirical work that shows how that plays out. And it plays out such that you can end up with 4 Nobel Prize winning physicists. You can basically pick your physicist. Like if you're going to go into a debate, to debate global warming, and you want to have, like suppose you were Joe Biden or Paul Ryan, and you actually wanted to talk about climate change, you could kind of say, well, this Nobel Prize physicist, and you could pick Ivar Gaever, if you're a skeptic, and who was passionately angry about the American Physical Society message on climate because it included the word incontrovertible. And to him, that was like, that's religion. Only religion is incontrovertible, that science is never incontrovertible. And so he got so pissed off about that he was very publicly angry about the overstatements about global warming. Or you can obviously pick Steve Chu if you're really worried and you want action on emissions. Or Robert Laughlin is kind of in the middle. He did this critical, weird essay for American Thinker a couple of years ago. And Bert Richter is very engaged on the climate problem and on the energy challenge, he has a very particular point of view on how you go forward that would probably be different from that of many people in this room. So you can kind of find a Nobel Prize winning physicist to suit your agenda or your preconceptions of the issue. And I see that as being, part of our problem. And more information, more knowledge doesn't necessarily make everyone sort out the same way and say, I got it. And then at the same time, we have this other problem. By the way, the first kind of half of this talk is the downer. We're going to go down. We're going to go down deep, so hold on. But then we're going to come back up at least partway. So, those of us in the room who were, well, actually, it looks like you're mostly spent most of your lives in the 20th century. But increasingly, when I talk at colleges, I realize I'm looking at a room where most of the people in the room have spent most of their lives so far in the 21st century. But if you grew up in the 20th century, you grew up with Walter Cronkite or 2 or 3 other aging avuncular white guys, and then slowly they added women and African Americans, but they all had the same avuncular, here is what happened today. In fact, Walter Cronkite had this just fantastic sign-off.
This is my last broadcast as the anchor man of the CBS Evening News, and that's the way it is. Friday, March 6th, 1981.
So we didn't have to do any work. We were all told the way it is. And we all, you pick up the front page of the New York Times or the Providence Journal where I grew up, and you had someone tell you the state of the world. And so it was very relaxing and reassuring, and we had a common sense as a nation of the state of the world, what was happening in Vietnam or with civil rights or the science. And that's, of course, changed completely. Now, if you care about climate, by the way, that feeling that you got in the old days, and it wasn't random that it was a supper time. I mean, we watched Walter Cronkite while we had our mac and cheese. So you realize, to me, it's like we were all having a communal mac and cheese, comfort food, information and food dinner as a nation, tens of millions of people every night. And now we still dine on comfort food, but each of us can go out and select our own food. It's like the world's biggest buffet. So if you're into global warming, whether you're a skeptic or a professional naysayer or a really worried activist progressive, you can find your food and dine and feel comfortable. And you're in a restaurant where everyone is like you, and it's kind of sort of reassuring still, just like Walter Cronkite, but in a very different way. So I teach a course in blogging at at Pace University now, and one of the challenges I push the students on is that the internet can work in 2 different ways. It can make us even more compartmentalized and bubbleized than we were, or you can push back against that and create inclusive zone for constructive discourse, and use Twitter not just to find collaborators and colleagues, but also to follow people you disagree with and see what they're thinking and reading. But it takes a kind of a sense of purpose. You have to go into that morass with some training and some feeling of intentionality. And by the way, this feels like such a big space to all of us. I'm sure many people in this room go to a lot of these sites regularly, hopefully to .earth. I'm glad he didn't ask you, how many of you read .earth? Because that's like a litmus test. But then we have to remember, where does all that lie in our heads? And then it's this, there it is, see? Among all the other things we're thinking about and worrying about. And actually, this is not quantitative. If you go to the newsmap.jp website, you can see kind of a quantitative map of what people are paying attention to. And on that map, the environment doesn't even show up. I did a piece on .earth a couple of years ago about how small the space is for environmental coverage. And then, of course, climate within that is invisible. And it's not on the news map. It's not there. So we have all these big fights and discussions about this, and then you have to remember it's all in this. And so anyone, again, who thinks that if we suddenly magically have a clear conversation, unfiltered, unsullied, undistorted about global warming, that's going to make the world magically move in a new direction, I think it's wishful thinking when you realize where this sits in the rest of our landscape of worry. And sociologists have this phrase, they call it a finite pool of worry, finite pool of worry, or basket. And there's really good work that's been done by Elke Weber at Columbia University over the years on those issues. So what happens sometimes is those of us who really worry about global warming can push a little too hard. And the picture in the background here is of a polar bear. This was sent around by one of the environmental groups back in the mid-2000s to try to propagate a sense of concern about polar bears in an open water world. And the problem with the picture was that the reason the polar bear is looking freaked out is because the helicopter from which the photographer was taking the picture was like 40 feet overhead and buffeting him with downwash and downdraft. And the bear is basically saying, get the out of here. And it had nothing to do with drowning or any of that stuff. And then the cover of Time magazine, Be Worried, Be Very Worried. Around that time, I did a piece for the Times weekend review section called Yelling Fire on a Hot Planet, in which I interviewed sociologists and psychologists and political scientists. Helen Ingram at UC Irvine said to me, look, the things that people vote on are things that are soon, salient, and certain. And she said, this stuff this is not one of those things. And the other core notion there was the sociologists have known for a long time is you can't impose worry on somebody, especially not if you're not a trusted messenger, and the press are not a trusted messenger overall. Scientists are much more trusted. But if you're saying be worried, remember the image of Jim Backus, there's an instinctive tendency of us to recoil from messages like that rather than to respond to them. There can be a way that can work if you're pointing toward escape routes, actual ways to purposefully move forward to solve the problem or mitigate the risk. But with climate, again, that's hard. As you all know, the individuals don't have much power. You can turn off all the lights in your room, and that's not going to decarbonize China. So these are issues. Now, this is probably the lowest of the low depth here is the next slide, because suppose we had a perfect conversation about global warming. Suppose we had got rid of all the distortion and all of the misinformation and even took away all the distraction of the Biden debate and the horrors in Pakistan and everything else. Then the what you do about it part starts a whole new conversation. And I was so struck after the Fukushima Daiichi disaster when that nuclear power plant had the hydrogen explosion and there's some low-level radiation around it, and it was such a momentous event with the giant tsunami and two of the world's most influential and articulate environmentalists, George Monbiot and Bill McKibben, had completely opposite reactions. I wrote about it at the time. I was so struck. I put their arguments side by side on .earth. And Monbiot, who's a British writer, he said, this proves that nuclear power is incredibly robust. It took the worst earthquake in the history of the world in a populated area. It took a 40-foot tsunami, and it didn't kill anybody. As you know, more people were killed by the stress of the evacuation than by this. There's no actual mortality so far from radiation. And Bill McKibben wrote very passionately and articulately that this proves how brittle this technology is. We have to go to windmills and solar power, and that struck me so powerfully. And to see people who are so allied on one way, so differentiated in their approach to solutions, it was really striking. And again, it reveals to me that don't expect some magical thinking path forward if we peel away some of the layers that have been out there for a long time. And the other thing, in my .earth commentary, it's so interesting, there's a guy who goes by the name Asteroid Miner. Don't ask me why. He's a physicist. He's one of the anonymous. He's anonymous, but not a troll. He just is very passionate about global warming. He's totally worried about it. And there's a guy named Mike Roddy, who's there under his real name, who's very green and very much into renewable energy. And they go at it tooth and nail, day after day, over nuclear power. So it's like two people who they're the most, Roddy just hammers me all the time for not being worried enough. And it's so, I don't know, I would love to get someone to study the sociology of that, but that's another day. So you end up with this question, which I wrote about on .earth back in 2008. And this is not just a global warming issue, it's disaster mitigation, disaster risk mitigation. A reader wrote this really amazing thing in a comment. This is very early on, second year of .earth. This reader from Germany posted, it seems Homo sapiens at large needs to first get hit by the wall before changing path. There will always be some debating, denying the science, evidence, of walls and bricks. We can't falsify the theory about that wall ahead, so it's no science. Blah, 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 bang. And that blah, 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 bang has resonated with me a lot. And again, this is deeper than climate. We get this so wrong that along the coast of Japan, and that area is hammered by the tsunami, there were these tsunami stones that I wrote about when I heard about them, which were put in place, some of them centuries ago. And this one had this legend: high dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point. Now, again, if we can't, as communities or as a global community, recognize that level of threat, where it's etched in stone from past history in the very place, then how can we be confident that we're going to magically address this issue of projected disaster unfolding over longer time scales with, again, implicit questions about the pace and change and where things are going to be worse and all that stuff. So that's where we take a breath, and now we start to climb out of the hole. Hopefully, a little bit. And by the way, this is not just restricted to little villages in Japan. I've written repeatedly about Oregon being, they've identified 1,000 schools in Oregon. Engineers have assessed these schools. These are 1,000 schools they know are highly vulnerable to when the Cascadia megathrust fault does its next lurch, will have a high risk of collapsing. And the pace at which those schools are being retrofit is incredibly slow. And for those seismologists who study this stuff, they're like, and the engineers, they're like, they see it already as a train wreck. It's very analogous to what climate scientists talk to, always feel strongly. And they just, when finally there's a bond issue that does another $1 million or $2 million, they're like, oh God. And I've written about that repeatedly, but it's the same kind of thing. You just kind of see it happening, you see it, the vulnerability. To think that there'll be some wailing families out front of American schools that collapse when, remember this fault, now the problem there is memory. The fault hasn't lurched since the year 1700. And there's a very strong record showing that it's got a pretty significant probability of lurching in the next few decades, if not right now, in the next few moments, we don't know. But we don't do that. So getting back to climate, the good news, of course, is you can engage people on these issues. Climate does matter. It mattered in Moscow, it mattered in Pakistan, it matters there all the time, in places that are poor, that don't have access to money or to sources of energy or mobility. They're sitting ducks. It happened in Joplin, of course. Now, so climate generally, the extremes particularly, matter a lot to people, but as you know, the extremes, except for heat, are very tough to link to this background trend in greenhouse-driven climate change. But at least you can engage on the resilience side, the need to make sure our communities are durable in the face of the worst that nature can throw at us. And then water matters in terms of health, and extraordinary picture by one of the Times photographers a couple of years ago from one of the terrible droughts in Africa. And a picture I took in the Amazon in 1990 in Manaus, in a big city, where I walked into a funeral parlor and saw, and this is still true in many parts of the world, where you can basically buy a coffin in all sizes. It's kind of like Starbucks coffee, And to have that be a normal thing, and much of that is because of water, contaminated water, and other solvable problems. I see that as urgent a water imperative as dealing with robustness of supplies and making sure communities are resilient to flooding and drought. And so, but water matters. So water matters. The problem, of course, is in the world's most vulnerable places, there's no capacity even to think about climate. They can't even. In 2007, we did a series of stories, a package of stories in the New York Times called The Climate Divide, where here in Malawi, the Malawian budget for meteorology and climate stuff was $150,000. And as this scientist told one of our reporters, we basically can't chart anything. And I'm really glad Mickey Glantz, among others, he's still in Colorado, has worked really hard to try to boost African capacity to track climate conditions, to forecast short time scale things like drought patterns and stuff. there's so much opportunity there to blunt the impacts of climate extremes, whether they're driven by greenhouse warming or by the natural African extraordinary variation in climate conditions is secondary. And then we have to recognize that the world is actually divided, which is one of the points of this series, that here in northern and developed countries, we have issues. Obviously, last summer was pretty brutal. But remember, those farmers all have crop insurance. And there's bringing insurance to the tropical belt is something that's starting to happen, but it's not there yet. And we have a lot of money. One of our reporters, Sarah Lyle, went to the Netherlands, where they have this flood-prone areas along rivers. And this woman told her, this is a house that's designed to float up off its foundation and come back down again after one of their epic floods. And she says, well, we haven't floated, but we're looking forward to floating. I just invested 400,000 euros in my floatable house. I want to test drive it, So for her, it's like, it's kind of a theme park ride. And, there's some big expenses that are looming. New York, without some flood barriers like the Thames barrier, is going to eventually face some real problems with inundation, flooded subways, flooded tunnels. And those are not small numbers, but they're manageable, and they're a small part of our wealth. New Orleans could have been protected. It's such a small increment of our national wealth, but we neglected that city. The lesson in New Orleans was we did a great job along the Mississippi River side, had gold standard flood barriers, because that was part of a federal project that went up through 17 states. It was that state part, the city part, that faced the pontchartrain that was vulnerable and had the immersion happen, and it was like completely neglected. So we have to get some reality about how to get serious on those fronts. And I think, again, when you do that, you're starting to create a conversation around climate that can then build toward the much tougher task of decarbonization and emissions policy. But at least it gets people engaged in something that's real outside the front door. As it was in my house, this is Hurricane Irene, the remains of Irene. This is Phillips Brook Road, which was more than a brook. And this is just down the hill from where I live in the Hudson Valley. That's a neighbor's dog. And now, so they have not yet gotten all the FEMA money. There's FEMA money committed to rebuild the roads in Garrison. But as far as I can tell, so far, the rules for how we rebuild roads after disaster in the United States are that you rebuild to the existing standard, not to a standard anticipating that, hey, the science all points to higher likelihood of flooding rains, so why are you rebuilding to the existing standard? You're just setting up all these communities for more days of paralysis, more costs, et cetera. So you can have that discussion, and then that integrates in a community the reality that climate is changing. And unless so there's a real opportunity there. At the level of the town, and plenty of places in New Jersey face the same issue with river flooding and road robustness. So you can build toward the tougher stuff. Now, of course, energy matters hugely to everybody. It matters to the 2 billion people like the woman at the left who have no sustainable source of energy except for the dirtiest fossil fuels or firewood. And the people in India who had the 600 million people who were without power after finally having electricity. They had this mega blackout. And then that other scene, that's some of our other issues. That's the innards of Indian Point. I was in there. I shot that video, I guess it was about 2 years ago. No, it was right after Fukushima. I went to tour Indian Point to see how we deal with our spent fuel. And that's a very contentious issue where I live. It's actually a contentious issue in my house. My wife and I disagree on what to do about Indian Point. I say, look, it's running. It's actually safer to keep it running, to have the company have an interest in keeping it running than to start to decommission it now. So energy, and then if you take that away, if you close Indian Point and you don't want fracking as well, then you kind of create all these tensions. And the tensions over energy are largely, if you keep crossing stuff off, you have to put something back on the list. And just think of what's happening in Europe right now. As I tweeted the other day, I haven't had time to write about it, but the recarbonization of Germany is happening because Germany is shutting down its nuclear power plants, and because of price issues that relate to natural gas is more costly, and the price of carbon permits is low enough that it's actually cheaper for them to build new coal-fired power plants and burn coal than it is to move to natural gas. And you look at this and you go, oh my God, super wicked. Now, here's some of the most encouraging. Well, no, we're going. It's tough, you know. It's a hard climb. I was with a guy earlier today who was one of the first people to climb El Capitan. 50 years ago, he and some friends, they were like the pioneering rock climbers. It's not that hard, I think, but maybe close. Can you imagine doing that without someone having actually put the pitons in place? I mean, I can't imagine doing it anyway. So anyway, the Six Americas study that's been done periodically by Yale and others reveals a lot of interesting things. There's some problems with the study, which I've had a conversation just the last 24 hours with the authors on the latest version. But this was really interesting to me. In 2009, in the run-up to the cap-and-trade bill, they ran all these ideas past people. They said, look, would you support cap-and-trade? And what you see here, if you're not familiar with that analysis, periodically they look at they've tried to categorize American attitudes on climate change into bubbles. There's alarmed at one end, dismissive at the other, and then a range in between. And you can see sort of the relative size of the bubbles is the size of those portions of the survey. And the bubbles have changed somewhat over time. The dismissive bubble is bigger, the alarmed is smaller. But in most of the ones in between, frankly, to me, I think they're all the same. They're just disengaged. They're you know, differentiating between a concerned and cautious person on global warming, I think is kind of meaningless. At any rate, so here is this question. Cap-and-trade bill, yes or no? Yes is at the top, no is at the bottom, maybe is in the middle. So even the alarmed, even those who completely bought the notion that we're headed imminently toward a climate disaster without urgent action, were only halfway. They were at the maybe point on that question, which either meant, of course, a lot of this meant that no one really understood cap-and-trade anyway. But that actually shouldn't matter, right? Because if you're in that category, you're part of the team, and so you'll vote for the thing that the team wants to do, and yet they were still maybe. And of course, the dismissives and everybody else is like, screw this. So that looks depressing. But then you ask, whoops. So support for providing rebates for purchases of solar panels and fuel-efficient vehicles, even the dismissives are like, maybe. And that's kind of interesting. Although when I talk to economists about this, economists in the room, they say, well, that's because you're giving away money. You know, it's basically, you're giving out something, so why would anyone oppose that? But then this third question is the one that sort of violates that that's what's in play. Support for requiring a mandate, requiring, think about Paul Ryan, and put Paul Ryan in your head, think of 45 miles per gallon fuel efficiency across vehicle fleets, even at $1,000 price premium. So you're telling people, we're going to order you to do this, and it's going to cost money. And even then, only the dismissives are like saying, because it's about efficiency, it's about something that I think is a much easier issue to capture people's attention on than something like global warming, which comes again with all of these laden questions. Now, then we move to how low the fruit is hanging, and I'm not saying that just R&D is sufficient. I've had this running discussion with people about deployment versus basic science, but it's an indicator, it's a proxy for what we're interested in. And I've shown this graph before. I might have even shown it at Princeton at some point. This is our history of science, federally funded science, for 50 years. So Sputnik's over here, and we went, oh my God, we got to go to the moon. And so that's the moon, the space race, the yellow. And then we got richer and started thinking about other things. And so Nixon and everyone built the war on cancer, which is the purple-blue thing. Got up to about 40 billion a year. So 40 billion a year is kind of like, this is constant dollars. It's kind of like a bellwether for what we care about. So we cared about space, we cared about cancer, and that, even though that didn't really go very far in terms of outcomes. And Gina Colada, who lives here, wrote a really good series, The 40 Years' War, about how that money didn't seem to have been very well spent. But it tells you what we care about. And then energy, of course, is the green ribbon that looks like one of the Burmese pythons I chased in the Everglades a couple of years ago. And it looks like it swallowed a rabbit. That was the oil crisis in the 70s. And then you see this bipartisan slumber party. And there's no Republican or Democratic wiggling in the investment in energy. It just goes away, goes away. And then you finally see the stimulus package. Look at that little blip. And of course, that's gone. That's all history and won't come back. And I've asked the guy who just wrote the book about the stimulus money, journalist at Time Magazine. Anyway, I said, you know, does that picture of a temporary influx of a couple of years worth of big money into an arena of science, is that the kind of thing that's a game changer? Does that get people shifting their careers into that area? Does that build a sense of this is a high priority? Not really, no. You know, you have to have sustained investment in an arena to have it become a real enterprise, like the space race was. So it's a very discouraging thing, but as John Holdren wrote well before he was a science advisor, you know, it would be a 2-cent wiggle in the gas tax. A 2-cent change would, I think it's double, triple, or quadruple. It would greatly increase that basic chunk of money going into inquiry in an area that we know is vitally important for the prosperity of this country and others going forward. Now, the other low-hanging fruit is overseas, where there's so many people who don't, you know, we have these big debates about which light bulb to put in, and there they have no lights, such that these kids oh God, blanking, a tiny country. Anyway, as I say sometimes around the house, I had a stroke. I did have a stroke a year and a half ago, but I can't blame that. No, it's Guinea. So they come out of the slums in the evening to do their homework. They have to go to the airport parking lot to do their homework because they don't have light at home. And that's just, I mean, to me, that's absolutely as scandalous as us being overly flush with carbon-based fuels. You know, there's something there that's a huge opportunity for someone, whether it's micro development, to make a difference. And these kids, these are the kids who already have their books. They're already trying to get ahead and get a job. And for them to actually be actively denied that possibility by the simple lack of a light bulb is as scandalous as anything we've talked about over the years related to global warming inertia. And it's addressable. And then here's where we're going up the slope, you know. Here, Libby Rosenthal, one of my friends at the Times, who I've known forever, she went to Kenya, I think it was 2010, and went to a rural village and found this woman who became an entrepreneur in her village after she got really frustrated with having to go into the town nearby once a week or so to recharge her cell phone. And she had to pay a merchant a very high rate for that tiny dribble of electricity to recharge her cell phone. So she learned that you could get these little solar panels for not much money. She saved up money. She put this tiny panel on her roof. And it was enough for her not only to charge her own cell phone, but to, she had a surplus. So you'll see in a second, her kids could do their homework at night. So here in a rural part of Africa, she had more illumination than those kids in the slum outside the capital city of Guinea. And she also had enough of a surplus that she started a business charging her friends, her neighbors' cell phones. And then that was going great. She made back her money on her panel. And now her neighbors, of course, as Libby reported, they put her out of business because they said, hey, we should get some of those too. So a little fire got set there, that little tiny dribble of watt minutes, not kilowatt hours, was transformative in a way that just shows you the power of making sure that any sense of an energy quest that we have extends from that end, the uncarbonized, unenergized part of our planet, 2 billion or more people, to the questions that we have to consider in trying to rein in our carbon-rich lifestyle. And by the way, just to tell you, this is what's happened with cell phones. This is why she had the cell phone in a rural part of Africa. 700 million cell phones in 2000, 5-point-something billion in 2010, close to 6 billion now, billion with a B. And look at the change. It was the majority were in rich countries, and now 3/4 of them are in poor countries. And as you can see in that village, it's completely transformative. It's a bank. It's your connection to the crop price. It's got such power, outsized power. It's priceless. So you put that connectivity, that information flow together with lights, and you have unbelievable opportunities to fast forward out of poverty in places that are immersed in it. So after decades of writing about this stuff, I kind of shifted gears from a focus purely on climate to, as I said in some post, if I had to put a bumper sticker on my Prius that I drove here in, it would not be the first one, it would be the second one. And it doesn't, and I wouldn't say necessarily it has to be clean energy, because in a country that has no energy options, where you see the impact that has on people's lives, you know, whether it's propane, a fossil fuel, or not, is irrelevant. It's just get them the energy they need to live a decent life. And then we have the responsibility to push really hard to find new norms that can be affordable even in poor countries. Now, I want to move to the realm of communication, which is where I've been for the most of my life. And I do think there's a role for thinking about communication in new ways as a way forward. And one thing is to clarify language. And I just want to swing back to the new Yale report. When they did their survey it was about connections between extreme weather and global warming. But the definition they used for global warming in the survey that they give to a couple thousand people was a warming planet. So when we're having a policy discussion about what to do about greenhouse gases, and you'll see, just go on Google right now and search for global warming extreme in Yale, and you'll see a lot of coverage. Oh, look, a bunch of people, the whole world really now connects extreme weather with global warming. None of that data reflects people's understanding of whether or how much of the warming is human-driven. So how can that be relevant to discussion of emissions policy? Unless it's, well, that reality doesn't matter. Meaning it's okay to get them engaged on thinking that extreme weather is driven by us, even though they weren't asked that question. So definitions matter. And the reason I showed this graph is it's a way I've used, just with the science questions, just the science, not the what do you do about it part, to differentiate the level of knowledge we have on some things versus other things. The IPCC has done similar things with words, likely, very likely. But I thought, okay, so the basics of the greenhouse effect, you know, more CO2 warming world is a very, if you wanted to make a bell curve of what people, including scientists, think about that, it's spiky. It's very spiky. It's a very powerful established idea, established through theory, through observation, through looking at other planets. So that's a spiky thing. But then you get to the stuff that we actually care about, which is how hot is it going to get, how quickly? Those curves are durably not spiky. And that's why I don't think, so often global warming is talked about, people will get into a big fight with their hair raising and their brows turning red about global warming without actually saying, so what's your definition of it? If I had you all write down on a scrap of paper your definition, I did this at UC Santa Barbara recently, I taught a week-long seminar there. I got everyone to sort of write down beforehand what they thought the phrase global warming meant, and there was a big range. And so as a communicator, I said, let's at least get the language straight. If you're going to go into a fight, you should at least clarify what you're talking about. So if you're just talking about global warming, and for many people, it's some of these things. It's not that thing. And so this says, warming from a double CO2 concentration is durably unclear. It's not a flat line, but there's a huge range of durable uncertainty around that idea. Regional climate forecasts, I was just with Gavin Schmidt yesterday, and he said, he keeps getting asked, how soon will we get better at regional or short timescale climate forecasts? And he says, forget about it. You can ask him. Hurricanes, as you know, in the 80s, when I first interviewed Kerry Emanuel for my big story in Discover, he said he projected a 50% intensification of hurricanes in a warming world. And now it's so much more nuanced, as many of you know. Tom Knudsen, I don't know if he's here today. We're talking about fewer hurricanes overall, but the stronger ones getting stronger, or more getting into the strongest category. And for a policy planner in a coastal city, that doesn't really give you a lot of information. It just says, that's okay, we should stay out of the way of hurricanes. So it's tough stuff. So at least use language, try to find ways to clarify the language, and I think we'll have some progress. At least, it's like going into a non-debate. What are the things we don't disagree on? What can we... Michael Crichton, by the way, I talked to him before he died. He was this arch antagonist. Antagonist is different than skeptic of global warming science. He didn't disagree with that at all. And he said, greenhouse gases function. I just think there's more important things to work on. So at least you can start to have a cogent discussion. So now there's this thing called the web. And what I showed you a minute ago, that picture of the web with all the different buckets for everyone and the buffet, it does work. It can work to increase polarization and and actually reduce crosstalk, even as it's the most revolutionary tool ever for connectedness. But it can also work like Match.com, which I've been happily married for a long time, so I've never actually used it, but I know how it works. And the New York Academy of Sciences has set up a sort of prototype Match.com for science and problems called, oh my God, here we go again. It's Scientists Without Borders. And so you can have this ability to share and shape ideas and to collaborate on solving problems across time and space that's just never been there before. And it's just amazing what you can do. So I think that there's great potential to use this tool with intentionality, and that means with a value set, with a sense of a goal, with a sense of purpose to clarify conversations. An institution like Princeton, the people at Climate Central, they've kind of worked at it. I don't think it's perfect, but I like what they've been trying. Realclimate.org, I think, has really been useful. It's a vital touchstone on the internet about climate. Even for, if you're a skeptic, I think a lot of them go there to kind of just sort of see what's going on. And so making sure you're engaged in that conversation is helpful. And then it can do some stuff that's cool. Like you could have a Match.com for what science teachers need. And there's many people who can fill that gap. And I won't show you, but the science teachers, I was at a meeting of the AAAS a couple of years ago. There was a meeting there on what science teachers need. And one of the things they need is introductory videos, little video explainers, that not like epic Frozen Planet multi-part series, but like a 1-minute thing on how sea ice works, or what's gravity, or what's a virus. And that's where kids with audiovisual computer skills can come in and build stuff and provide it so we can engage in a cogent learning process in some of these tough things. But getting back, I want to get back to the idea of the internet as a linkage thing. Atlantic Rising was this effort a couple of years ago by some young people in England who went around the borders of the Atlantic Ocean to communities from Ghana to Scotland to Massachusetts and ran these workshops, coastal workshops for students on sea level rise. But they didn't end there. They then worked to link up these different students in different communities who all share the common reality that they live on a coast, whether it was Nantucket or Ghana. And they were Skyping and doing all kinds of interactivity in ways that I think are very promising. And so building those kinds of networks, learning networks and collaborative networks is a great thing. And you could leave this, you could dip down in a little valley on the way forward. You can leave this all to the guys in gray suits. Like these are the United States, China, and India at one of the treaty talks a couple of years ago. I took this picture. But China and India, China and the United States, as I've written repeatedly, have been like Alphonse and Gaston in the famous actors, theatrical comedy of, oh, you first, sir, you first, sir. Now, there's plenty that can be done to sort of see if there's ways to make that into a more meaningful conversation between these two mega emitters. But I see this bottom-up stuff as having more potential and actually being a requisite to having meaningful change at the top. And now all of this speaks against urgency. Or you could say, well, but we need to do this quicker. And I've heard this argument over and over and over again from David Roberts at GRIST and Joe Rahm. And this is urgent, 2 degrees, blah, blah, blah. And I just find that to have no real meaning to me, given what I've learned about the nature of the human species and where we're at in our development, and as a species and as individuals. And I think we just have to get to realize, the guardrail we're going to need to. There'll be some scraping that we're not going to get this right, but the key thing is to not get it completely wrong, to do what we can to boost our capacity for resilience, our capacity for ingenuity, and our capacity for empathy, for having a sense of the global commons be a real thing. And I think, again, the web, gives potential to do all those things. And I wish that instead of having the metric be gigatons, we need to find a way to measure the capacity for resilience, the capacity for ingenuity, and literacy in science is another one, and the capacity to collaborate going forward. And then you'd start to see something interesting. And again, scientists, and you see different approaches. There is no cookie cutter thing here. Jim Hansen and Susan Solomon Both have played powerful and influential, important roles in the public dissemination of science. And I interviewed Susan in 2007 after the big IPCC rollout that she ran. And I don't know, who was there? Anyone there? Was anyone there? It was very interesting. A BBC reporter, I wasn't there, Libby Rosenthal was there, and I was reporting from New York. And she was badgered by this reporter. Okay, you've told us this is science. Now tell us what you think. Tell us what you feel. They wanted that, what do you feel about it question. And she sat back. I'm not going to quote it directly. I wrote a profile of her where it's in there. She said, "That's not my job, sir. My job is to give you the information, and you have to chew on it, and spit it out in some way." And she was really resistant to the idea that she had to play a role in selling these solutions. And Jim Hansen, of course, has been completely different, chaining himself to fences, and he was at a Greenpeace event in New York City a week or two ago, and goes to hearings, and he's very much a public activist, and I'm not here to say who's right or wrong. In fact, I taught a seminar at Bard College a few years ago to graduate students in environmental policy, and it was a course on communication and policy, and I forced them to go into a debate where they were split in half. Half of them were Hansenites and half of them were Solomonites, and they had to hash this out. And then at the end of this exercise, I asked them, what were you going in? Who did you side with? And virtually all were Hansen. They preferred Jim's approach. Coming out, they were much more like, oh my God, that comes with a lot of issues. And there's no simple answer to that advocacy versus science question, or being public versus being just doing the work. Everyone has a different set of factors that they can make their own judgments on that going forward. And for students and for young people, it's the same way. These kids who were in 2005 were in Montreal, blocking the halls and with signs saying, "Hey, it's our atmosphere you're screwing up." That's a role to have, shaking up those gray suits. And then this kid at MIT, who I wrote about a few years ago, when he was 18 years old, his family went on a summer trip to China. They got stuck in a traffic jam. He saw all the pollution. He said, I'm going to invent an electric motorcycle. And his grandfather was a metal worker, and so they had a really cool shop. And so he built himself an electric motorcycle with the wheels are parallel, and it's got a gyro. I'm not sure what happened with his little nascent company, but that almost doesn't matter. And of course, 9 billion people riding around on electric motorcycles is not going to save the planet, especially if the coal is generating the electricity. But I loved his spirit, the idea that he could see a problem and then dive in. And I'm not saying which of those is right or wrong. That's for people to make their own judgments. I do think it's essential, if not for every individual scientist, for the institutions of science to get out of what Randy Olson, my friend, calls the nerd loop, meaning where we just sit in rooms talking to each other about how to communicate, as opposed to just experimenting, trying stuff. I was just with Richard Alley yesterday at this meeting on the Anthropocene, and I've written about him. He dances, he sings. Of course, he's got tenure, which makes it easier to be a wacko and have fun. But he's trying. He's working on it. And Andy Bunn is at Western Washington University. I think a few years back, he was going to Siberia with a bunch of students and to do a project on paleoclimate work where they were going down a river and digging in the mud, and he said, "You want to come?" And I said, "Well, I can't. It's too much money, too far, too everything, and too buggy." And so I said, "But you've got cameras and stuff. Send me some audio. Send me some pictures, and I'll do a piece for .earth." And we created this. It actually started this occasional feature I do. Essentially, it's postcards from places, and it worked. It's a new thing. It's not journalism. It's not a press release. It's like in between, but it's like trying. And then there's, I can show or tell you the size of the atmosphere, the volume. And Andrew Newman in England, a science illustrator, said, well, this is what you could show it in this way. And I think it's so much more interesting. That's the volume. If you took all the air in the atmosphere, put it at sea level pressure, that's what you're looking at in a spherical volume. And it's a great way to start a conversation about commons, to just say, well, actually it is pretty finite. And Al Gore tried his, there's the varnish on the globe, there's different ways, but it should be testing ideas for how to do that. One of the big issues with global warming is it's not like the pollution I grew up with. This is the 20th century pollution, which of course is the norm in Shanghai and other parts of the developing world that are essentially in our 20th century now. And one time on .earth I wrote a piece, well, God, what if CO2 were pink? Maybe that would make a difference. You know, for the atmosphere is pinkifying. But there's so many issues with that would mean it wouldn't work anyway. Our shifting baselines of perception, we wouldn't notice that it was pinkifying because it would be over, the gradation of time would be too slow. But there are ways to visualize the invisible. One is to just choose your wavelength right. So this is, on a nice sunny day, that's what an oil tank outside of Colorado looks like. And then with an infrared video camera, that's the methane that's escaping from it. And I put this on the Times website in 2009 when I wrote a front page story about this issue of methane leakage from oil and gas installations. And so, you know, we're not thinking always with that in mind. And, you know, if people kind of were driving up some highway in Denver and saw that, we don't see in infrared, but they would start to understand things better. So making sure you're using the right wavelength, the right tool for the right job, essentially. And the other thing that's cool about that is it reminds you, hey, methane's a greenhouse gas. What is a greenhouse gas? It's opaque to infrared. Wait, opaque to, no, it's opaque to, yes. Sun goes through it. Yeah. At any rate, so I want to end with one last thing. Like Richard Alley, I do dabble in music, and sometimes it's worth crossing borders and trying other ways of telling stories. And now, my little account of I have a 2-minute song. It's a 2-minute history of our love affair with fossil fuels. And me singing it is not going to change the world. But if I could get like Springsteen to sing it, then who knows? So anyway, here it is.
It took 1,000 generations for our species to rise, but gathering and hunting was no way to get by. We yearned to burn more than dung and sticks. Then someone came along and said, hey, try lighting this. He opened up the ground and showed us coal and oil. Said, come liberate some carbon, it'll make your blood boil. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe, it's the American way. Now I got peat swamp fossils running my TV. BP's black label burns in my SUV. We can light up the planet like a Christmas tree. Yeah, they say that things are getting hot, but hey, we've got AC. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day.
I love the lightning.
Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe, it's the American way. Pump those electrons and that gasoline. No sweat or hurry, just turn on a machine. We send an army to the desert to keep this country free. Hey, hey, and to liberate some carbon, baby, for you and me. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, baby.
That's another way to see the thinness of the
Liberate
atmosphere,
some
of course.
carbon,
The
baby.
space station footage is incredible.
Liberate some carbon, babe, it's the American way.
So that's the story. That's us from the Carl Sagan, moment, and this is me. I'm really easy to find, so if you want to follow up along with questions, we can do that too. Thank you. Do we have time for a question?
Yeah, I think we have time for a few questions. So fire away.
Now, did you all end up totally down or up?
David.
Down?
Somebody was asking earlier, down. Somebody was asking a question earlier about bias in the media coming from sort of false equivalency. Do you want to
Yeah.
question as well as she did, but do you want to
Yeah. That exists for sure. I mean, you can see it. But you can see it with presidential coverage as well. Like, you look at, it's a norm, absolutely, of the media, and it has distorted coverage. It did distort coverage for a long time away from the scientific consensus. Yes, there was drift that way because of that obligation to have. You still see people who are not actively publishing in the literature end up in stories tacked on at the end as kind of the voice of doubt, and that's problematic. But what I think has been oversold is that it's been oversold to some extent, and here's why. Because that's relevant if the story is about sea ice, or some basic science question, hurricanes, or extreme weather in a warming world, a greenhouse, in the greenhouse effect. And when you see a stray voice like that in an article, I think it is problematic. And I try hard in my stories in the pieces I did when I was working reporter, and in my blog posts to keep the discussion among those who are publishing on the question. But the place where it no longer applies is when you get to the what do you do about it stories. And I think, like when Max Boykoff he and his brother wrote that piece about, had a really balance as bias. This is 2004. It was a really good survey of the newspaper articles, Times, Wall Street Journal, where they found this drift. The problem is they didn't distinguish between stories on policy and stories on the basic science. And when you get into the what do you do about it part of this question, everybody has a voice in that story. Should it be a bill? Should it be a cap on carbon? Should it be a big program to push nuclear power? Should be there you get everyone in the room, because once you spill from the basic science questions into the what do you do about it stuff, it's a broader pool. And there, when you can have a Competitive Enterprise Institute guy in that story, and it would be a legitimate part of the conversation, because they're in Washington, they're part of what's working there to influence those outcomes. If they were in a story on sea ice, that's a problem. And it takes work, and here's where you run into these issues, because what happens in the media, remember, the science media are shrinking faster than the media overall, and the media overall are shrinking we're a shrinking wedge of a huge growing way to communicate, a growing pool of ways to communicate. So, and the talent pool, I'm a graybeard, literally, and Peter Spots, there's me, there's like 2 other people who've been covering this for a long period of time. And then everyone else who's a newcomer has less space, less time, less of a sense of who to talk to about a particular question, and so you end up with some pretty ridiculous stuff still. But I think there is this overselling of the balance issue, because unless you're distinguishing between stories on policy and stories on science, it's creating a mashup.
Question over there.
I wanted to go back to the point you made about the fact that we recoil from being sort of having the finger pointed at us, but that there is a way out of that when you give people a pathway to a solution. And I'm kind of struggling with the idea that climate scientists are often told to stick to explaining the problem and not to make sort of prescriptions about the solution. And I wonder whether that is also perhaps
No, it's really important. And I was just talking with Richard Alley about this yesterday. I said it's the 2-sentence solution, the 2-sentence solution. You can talk, spend 20 minutes or 20 seconds filling someone in on your work as a scientist related to this question, whether it's on sea ice or clouds or aerosols or whatever, and then you have a period, and you pause and you say, now, as a voter and a father or a mother or whatever, this is what I feel we should do. And I've seen this done effectively. When it's done effectively, it's beautiful. I saw an economist do this meeting a couple of years ago on climate and economics, where she just had this artfully wonderful way of separating the is from the ought. And this is David Hume. It was actually Ken Caldera, a climate scientist, who apparently got his undergraduate degree in philosophy. He led me to David Hume's work on the is-ought problem. And you can talk about both, and just not in the same sentence. And what happened too often, And this includes from the IPCC leadership. And Al Gore was to make it one sentence. And when you make it one sentence, here's the science and you should do this. That leads to problems because the first problem is it disengages a big chunk of your audience. Anyone who disagrees with your solution will immediately also doubt your scientific argument. And it also just sort of, it has a preachy quality to it. So I think there is a way to do it, but there's training that can be done. And the Aldo Leopold program is, I think there could be more of that stuff too. Having people run through your practice how to talk about this stuff, and you could have better outcomes.
Question there.
Andy, since
we were just together yesterday.
So I just wanted to bring forward what was terrific about the conference at the Smithsonian, have you comment maybe a little bit more, was that it was the science, it was Richard Alley, but it was also humanities and what the Princeton Environmental Institute is trying to do to bring this conversation together. And that was one of the richest discussions of that type. And in particular, in the afternoon when we had Subhankar Banerjee, whose pictures of the Arctic transformed our sense of what was happening up there, and Chris Jordan, who did this
amazing work,
making a film on Midway and the impact on the albatross and the plastic from the Pacific. So I'd love you to just comment, about
Sure.
that.
Well, along with the is-ought divide, there is the reality that any of these decisions, whether it's on fracking or the merits of nuclear power or on how much warming is too much, at what pace, how much sea level is too much, those decisions are framed largely by values. I mean, the science frames the issue. With the uncertainty bars, it says if you go in this path, and this is what the IPCC was so valuable about the IPCC, was it was a set of scenarios and you had a sense of outcomes. But the question of how much is too much is not a question of science. In fact, I wrote critically about the 2-degree threshold that the European Union kind of really pushed that idea that should be the threshold. And I'm glad that Gavin Schmidt at Real Climate pushed back about that framing, as if it was a science-based decision about how much is too much. I think that was problematic. And I think we have to get comfortable and actually embrace the reality that these decisions in the end will be framed as much or more by values choices as by the science. The science kind of sets the parameters of the question, but doesn't determine the answer. And that's what the IPCC was so good at that I think that's why it's been good to have it around.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a Stanford graduate here. And I do know that the government recently cut some funding for the Plasma Physics Lab, which is research on magnetic fusion, which is potentially another source of energy. I was wondering what you thought about fusion as possible.
About fusion? I was just talking to people about this yesterday. The Times had an editorial last week about the laser ignition facility. Another big budget issue, they kind of failed again. And the question is, at what point do you have that 50-year window where you say, you know what, it's just not worth it? And that discussion is intensifying right now. And I don't know, there are people in this room who would be better at answering that question about how much you invest in the 100-yard pass, the Hail Mary, versus doing the grunt work of working incrementally to improve today's renewables versus deployment money. And this is the dispute I've had with Joe Rahm over the years at Climate Progress over the balance of how much you do on the deployment of today's renewables versus pushing for the big advances. And again, there's no easy answer there. So with fusion, I don't know enough about the specifics of the technological impediments to give you my own reasoned answer to the question of how much is too much. It's like with climate, how much is too much? It's an interesting tug of war over these things. And Rob, I don't know if you or anybody else has some thoughts on that. Who else is in the big physics room? You're going to hold off.
Well, fusion is one of the possibilities of working out the 1,500-year time frame. I don't know what the Times wrote about the inertial confinement, which is the other way of doing things, but it suffered from tremendous hype, so that when they had a shortfall, it looks much worse than it would have been if they'd said this is our thing to do.
I know, that's an issue. I brought that up at this microbiome meeting. You know, it's important not to oversell the technology. Like, if they jump too quickly to say this microbiome work is going to solve the problem of diarrhea and asthma, actually it's amazing how they are finding connections between asthma and certain microbes that either are in you or not. You know, if they oversell that in the beginning, then you end up with this disaffection later on. So that's a tough issue as well in all the sciences.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering if you have any advice or tips for young budding science journalists of how we can improve our writing to translate the complex into the concise. If you have any advice, suggestions, or tips, that we greatly appreciate.
Email me. No, I mean, there's the main thing is just to do it, to start, to create a blog or at least a Tumblr account and just to tell the world what you're learning. And at the early stages, my blogging, I created a course a year ago called Blogging a Better Planet, and I'm not teaching them at all. I'm just co-learning with them because the whole dynamic of these ways to communicate is evolving so rapidly. There's new tools every couple of months to play with. But if you're not out there experimenting, then you're losing an opportunity. And just say from the get-go that this is a learning process. Here I am being public about science umbrella. Some of the things I'm going to get wrong. Tell me when I get it wrong. That's the great aspect of the web.
Yeah.
As a communication device, I was wondering if anybody ever did a piece on putting out two lists. One list identifying all the organizations and individuals advocating for action on climate versus organizations and individuals who are in the denier camp. I think if the average person looked at those two lists, choice would be clear. What group has the most credibility?
It sounds like a good thing to do. I'm sure DSmog blog, or there's probably someone who's done some iteration of that. SourceWatch is kind of like a website that does that implicitly, although they don't do it side by side. So it sounds like a good to-do list. Yeah.
Okay. I think, speaking for myself, we're ready for a drink, so let's thank